I've always been really interested in the concept of the criminal underworld. I do think it's a constructed concept, and part of the aim of the book was to try and figure out how that concept evolved over time. Why did people have such a firm belief that there was this separate underworld where people resided and where they had their own society? The book's less an attempt to really understand the whole of the underworld. I mean, it's pretty impossible. You can't really uncover the underworld. All you can do is look at the different ways in which people have thought about and written about the underworld. So, for example, we look at the press, we look at print culture and how that evolves over time. So, in that sense, it's a sort of cultural and social history of these ideas about crime, which have been very powerful over time, and indeed, in a contemporary society where we still talk about the underclass, they remain very powerful. So, on the one hand, that's what it's attempting to do. It's trying to survey those understandings of different types of crime, and particularly about serious property crime, theft, and burglary, theft, pickpocketing. And the range of sort of property crimes that develop in this period. On the other hand, it does attempt through the 3 case studies to look at the lives of so-called criminals. So I look at 3 different groups. They're all kin, so they're all families, which is probably a coincidence, but may tell us something about the way these networks are constructed, and also about how crime is perceived from outside. One case study I looked at was the Sheen family who lived in Wentworth Street in Whitechapel in East London. William Sheen was quite a notorious offender who ran juvenile offenders and prostitutes from his lodging houses in Whitechapel. And he and his mother and father and also 1 or 2 brothers were all involved in criminal activity, either as offenders or sometimes as witnesses, so they give information in court cases. And the case is an interesting one because it tells us not only about the activity of the Sheen family, but also about the local community. The community, perhaps not surprisingly, are actually fairly hostile to the Sheens. They're not liked. And I think this is quite interesting because the community, the area is one that's perceived as being quite a criminal area from outside. And yet here we see local people who are not very happy with the Sheens, who actually criticise them in the courtroom, in the open courtroom, in the Old Bailey. So it gives a bit more nuance to that idea of the criminal community of the underworld. It also tells us a little about the relationships with the police, the local police, who use the Sheens as informers in some of the cases in which they're involved, which again, raises questions about that sort of slightly corrupt relationship between the police and the police at this time. The research was based on original primary documents from the National Archives and also from various local record offices in London. At the National Archives, I used Metropolitan Police records and Home Office records most heavily. Many of the cases I looked at tended to involve criminals who had gained some sort of visibility within their lifetime, or certainly within the period that they were offending or known offenders. So there tend to be some traces of them left in the various criminal records. I also used the Old Bailey online, which is the proceedings of the Old Bailey courtroom, and those have been usefully digitised in the last decade or so, so they're a fantastic source to use. I also drew on the press and also the writings of various contemporary authors in the 19th century in particular, but also in the early 20th century. There are a lot of contemporary writers who are discussing the problems with crime and discussing the idea of the underworld. So they're quite a useful source if they have to be read very critically.